Since its release, Runaway Train has helped recover 21 missing children, but not everyone is that lucky. On March 11, 1989, after dropping his wife off at work, Dennis Bowman returned home to find the back door unlocked. A suitcase, along with the money from a piggy bank, was missing, and his daughter Aundria was nowhere to be found. For more than 3 decades, everyone believed she was just a teenage runaway, until investigators uncovered the truth. Aundria had never actually left home at all. To understand how the truth finally came to light, we have to go back long before Aundria disappeared. For nearly 14 years, Aundria Bowman was the sole focus of the household. But in January 1988, the dynamic inside the Bowman home shifted dramatically when Dennis and Brenda welcomed a second daughter, Vanessa. The arrival of the chubby, red-haired infant transformed Aundria's life. She went from being an only child to stepping into a role that was far heavier than simple big sister duties. Aundria found herself abruptly transitioned from a daughter into a surrogate parent. While her contemporaries at school were exploring the social freedoms of adolescence, attending football games or participating in extracurricular clubs, Aundria's world narrowed to the confines of domestic labor. Her afternoons and weekends were consumed by the relentless cycle of infant care, sterilization of bottles, changing diapers, and the constant supervision of her sister. She was no longer a child in the eyes of the household, but a functional extension of Brenda and Dennis's parental duties. Now, to be fair, in the late 1980s, it wasn't unusual for older kids, especially girls, to help take care of younger siblings. But this wasn't just that. This wasn't occasional help. This was every afternoon, every weekend. At some point, she stopped being a child in that house. To anyone outside the home, everything appeared entirely ordinary. The quiet landscape of Ottawa County, Michigan, in the late 1980s was a place where reputation and religious devotion formed an unspoken barrier against scrutiny. In the rural outskirts of Holland, at the intersection of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street, the Bowman family appeared to embody that ideal. Dennis, a former Navy reservist, held steady work as a wood machinist, while Brenda was a familiar face at the local Meyer jewelry counter. At church, they were known as devoted Sunday school teachers, reliable and well-respected in the community. But over time, signs of strain inside the Bowman home began to surface. Students at Aundria's school noticed disturbing details. On one occasion, she boarded the school bus with blood visible on her wrist. The explanations that followed were uncertain and conflicting. Some believed she had attempted self-harm, while others heard she had been locked out of the house and injured herself, trying to climb back through a window. Even so, no one pushed further. And that's the problem. Sometimes when everything looks normal on the outside, people stop asking the questions that matter. The Bowmans were seen as a good, church-going family, and that perception made it easy to look away from what might have been happening behind closed doors. On March 11, 1989, the tension in the Bowman household reached its breaking point. The day started like any other. Dennis drove 14-year-old Aundria to school for a band event. But when he picked her up later that afternoon, the atmosphere in the car was heavy. That evening, Dennis drove Brenda to her second shift job, taking the baby, Vanessa, with him so Aundria could focus on her homework. When he returned with Vanessa around 6:30 p.m., the farmhouse was dark. The silence was absolute. The back door was unlocked. He placed the baby on the sofa and called out for Aundria, but there was no answer. Upon investigating the second floor, Dennis noticed something unusual. The door to the master bedroom, normally kept locked, stood wide open. Inside, a small travel suitcase was gone. More importantly, the household's cash, the money from a recent tax refund, along with even the coins from Vanessa's piggy bank, was missing. When Brenda's shift ended at 11:30 p.m., she came home to the news that her daughter was gone. Distraught, she spent her nights driving the dark country roads of Ottawa County, scanning the cornfields and empty streets for any sign of Aundria. She searched until Dennis told her she had to stop, reminding her they still had a baby to raise. The investigative response of the late 1980s was heavily influenced by a prevailing social bias toward teenage rebellion. When Dennis contacted the police, he described Aundria as a troubled teenager who frequently clashed with her mother and had previously run away to a friend's house. In an era before GPS tracking and sophisticated forensic digital footprints, law enforcement often viewed such cases through the lens of status offenses, behaviors that were only considered issues because of the individual's age. Seeing no physical signs of a violent struggle and presented with a story of a missing suitcase and stolen money, the police officially labeled Aundria as a runaway. The case was funneled into the Youth Services Bureau, a move that effectively downgraded the urgency of the search from a potential kidnapping to a domestic disciplinary issue. In the community of Holland, the explanation made sense, and it spread quickly. Few people questioned it. But this is the part no one in that town knew. She wasn't even their biological daughter. This case is filled with twists you won't see coming, and a truth that took more than 3 decades to surface. So if you're into stories like this, make sure you're subscribed, because this one only gets darker from here. Aundria's story had begun long before she ever set foot in that house. It began in 1972 with a teenager named Kathy Turkanian. At the time, Kathy was just a child seeking escape. Living in Virginia with parents who viewed her as a burden, she ran away, hitchhiking with no money in her pocket until she reached Memphis, Tennessee. There, she met Randy Badger, a 19-year-old who offered her a way forward. In December of that year, the young couple traveled to South Carolina, where state law allowed a minor to marry with parental consent. Kathy's parents provided it readily, eager to relinquish responsibility for their daughter. The marriage was brief and unstable. Less than a year later, Kathy discovered she was pregnant. On June 23, 1974, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Alexis. But her circumstances did not improve. By the time Alexis was 5 months old, the marriage had collapsed. Kathy returned to her parents' home in Virginia, hoping for support, but found none. She was still a child herself, now raising a baby in a home that did not want either of them. Faced with that reality, Kathy made an agonizing decision. When Alexis was just 9 months old, she placed her for adoption in Norfolk, Virginia. It was a closed adoption, a legal separation that left no clear path back. She walked away holding on to a single hope, that one day when her daughter was grown, she might come looking for her mother. At the same time in Holland, Dennis and Brenda Bowman were struggling to have a child of their own. Brenda suffered from uterus didelphys, a rare congenital condition that made pregnancy extremely difficult. After years of disappointment, they turned to adoption. The system matched them with Kathy's infant daughter. They brought her home and gave her a new name, Aundria Michelle Bowman. Before her first birthday, the identity of Alexis had disappeared. She was now the daughter of Dennis and Brenda, growing up in the quiet religious stability of rural Michigan, the very life Kathy had once hoped to give her. By the time she vanished in 1989, that past was something no one in the community knew, or even thought to question. In the days following Aundria's disappearance, speculation quickly filled the silence she left behind. Many in Holland assumed that Aundria had grown tired of her strict home life and finally run away. Rumors spread. She had gone looking for her birth mother. She had caught a ride to a truck stop. She had left town with an older boy. She was pregnant. Brenda reported a series of tips in the weeks and months that followed, each one reinforcing the belief that Aundria was still alive and simply did not want to be found. Not long after Aundria disappeared in 1989, the Bowmans moved out of the Lincoln Road farmhouse and relocated to the nearby town of Hamilton, leaving the house and the case behind. For the public, her story came down to a single photograph, the same studio portrait given to police the day she went missing, showing a young girl against a blue backdrop, her eyes turned slightly away from the camera. At the time, most missing children were seen only on milk cartons or simple flyers, and Aundria's image started out the same way before reaching a much wider audience. It resurfaced in Runaway Train, a music video by Soul Asylum, directed by Tony Kaye, where the search for missing children was woven directly into a piece of mainstream media broadcast across MTV and VH1. Different regional versions circulated across the country, each embedding local cases into the sequence. In Michigan, Aundria's photograph appeared briefly just after the 2-minute mark, a fleeting moment of exposure for a girl who had already been gone for years. The project would later be credited with helping to locate more than 24 missing children. Aundria Bowman was not one of them. As the video stopped airing and public attention faded, her case slowly disappeared from the public eye. For 29 years, the Bowmans, the couple who had adopted her, maintained the image of a family tirelessly searching for their daughter, despite the whispers that followed them. But in mid-2018, the narrative shifted. Dennis and Brenda Bowman walked into the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, not to provide a lead, but to file a formal complaint. Their target was Kathy Turkanian, Andrea's biological mother. They accused Kathy of harassment and of spreading defamatory accusations online, specifically pointing the finger at Dennis regarding Aundria's disappearance. To understand what drove Kathy Turkanian to such lengths, one has to go back 8 years. In April 2010, Kathy received a letter that would shatter her world. It came from Carl Koppelman, an amateur forensic artist and a fixture on Web Sleuths, an online community where armchair detectives and investigators collaborate on cold cases. Inside the letter was something Kathy had never known before. The daughter she had given up for adoption had vanished at the age of 14. Carl also asked her to provide a DNA sample, explaining that it could be compared against unidentified remains to determine whether there was a biological match. For years, Kathy had imagined the life her daughter might have lived. Now, for the first time, she was being told that her daughter had disappeared and might already be dead. Carl had spent years studying missing persons cases through the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, searching for possible connections between missing people and unidentified remains. As part of that work, he created reconstructed portraits based on post-mortem images and shared them online, hoping someone might recognize a face. One case in particular had stayed with him: the Racine County Jane Doe, discovered in 1999 near a rural Wisconsin cornfield. Investigators believed the young woman had been killed elsewhere and dumped at the site. The autopsy painted a grim picture of her life: healed fractures, repeated injuries, and signs of long-term neglect and abuse. Despite not knowing her identity, more than 50 strangers attended her funeral. Carl began comparing the Jane Doe case against missing persons reports across the Midwest. Most led nowhere, but one name stopped him cold: Aundria Bowman. The similarities were difficult to ignore. By 1999, Aundria would have been around 25 years old, and Holland, Michigan was within driving distance of where the body had been found. Carl began to suspect that Aundria could be the unidentified woman discovered near the Wisconsin cornfield. Convinced the connection was worth investigating, he shared his findings with law enforcement, who agreed the possibility was compelling enough to pursue further. When Kathy read the letter in full, she agreed to provide her DNA without hesitation. But it also raised questions she had never asked before. She hadn't even known her daughter had been given a new name. Searching for answers, she turned to the internet. The moment she saw the school photo of the blue-eyed girl, the recognition was immediate and visceral. But one question still haunted her: who had raised her daughter and what had happened inside that home? To find out, Kathy reached out to a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly. O'Reilly didn't offer the reassurance she was hoping for. Instead, he pointed her toward the dark and deeply troubling history of Dennis Bowman. Determined to uncover the truth for herself, Kathy turned to the Freedom of Information Act, better known as FOIA, a federal law that allows citizens to request access to police files, investigative reports, and other government records. In the world of cold cases, a FOIA request is no guarantee of an answer. Agencies can withhold information under various exemptions, especially in active or sensitive investigations. But for old, stalled cases, it is often the only window into what the authorities knew, and more importantly, what they might have missed. For Kathy, it was the only way to see past the official story and finally find out what happened to her daughter. When Kathy finally received Dennis Bowman's criminal records from the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, they did more than provide information. They shattered the carefully curated facade of the hard-working, devout family man Dennis had presented to the world for decades. The files revealed a predatory history stretching back years. One of the earliest records detailed a 1979 assault that had made the front page of the Holland Sentinel. A 27-year-old woman had been bound, gagged, and assaulted by an intruder who broke into her home in the early hours of a Sunday morning. The police sketch from the time depicted a man with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses, a man Dennis Bowman would later admit was him. An incident from May 1980 was even more chilling. A 19-year-old girl was riding her bicycle in northern Holland, Michigan, when a man on a motorcycle forced her off the road. He ordered her to get off the bike and follow him into the woods. The young woman refused to move. The man pulled a gun, fired a shot toward her, and repeated the command. Still, she stood her ground. He fired again, this time into the dirt near her feet, and snarled a terrifying ultimatum. She would be next. At that exact moment, a car drove by. As the motorcyclist turned toward the sound, the girl seized her chance and pedaled away as fast as she could. The man didn't fire again or give chase, and she managed to flag down a passing pickup truck to get home. Her parents called the police immediately. She provided a surgical level of detail: a white male in sunglasses wearing a blue helmet, riding a motorcycle with a black storage box on the back. By the end of the day, police had a suspect in custody. The young woman needed only one look to confirm it. It was Dennis Bowman, already a husband and a father. Dennis was eventually convicted of assault with intent to commit a felony and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was referred for psychological counseling, where a judge explicitly noted that he was likely a danger to women if allowed to remain free. Despite this, Dennis served only the bare minimum of his sentence. His predatory patterns continued long after Aundria vanished. In 1998, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan, responded to a silent alarm at the mobile home of Vicky Vandenbrink. Vicky, then 28, had been burglarized so many times that the police had installed a specialized security system for her. When the trooper arrived, he caught Dennis Bowman walking out of the back door. Dennis's excuses shifted like sand. First, he claimed he was staying with Vicky, a former co-worker. He was initially allowed to leave, but when authorities reached Vicky, she confirmed he was lying. He then changed his story, claiming he had only entered the home to use the bathroom. He fabricated a story about a previous visit, claiming he had been there when his daughter Vanessa was selling Girl Scout cookies. Suspicious, police obtained a warrant for Dennis's home. Hidden in the attic of a shed, they found a black duffel bag. Inside was Vicky Vandenbrink's stolen underwear, along with a sawed-off shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. Under interrogation, his obsession came to light. Dennis admitted to stalking Vicky, breaking into her home to steal her intimate items, and even cutting a slit in her curtains so he could watch her whenever he pleased. He was charged with breaking and entering. Before his sentencing, 1 year in jail and 5 years of probation, Dennis wrote a letter to the judge. In it, he painted himself as a good man and a devoted father to 2 daughters, aged 25 and 11. He conspicuously failed to mention that the older daughter he was referring to had been missing for 10 years. He also rallied support from his community. Parishioners from his Catholic church and various friends wrote character references, vouching for him as a family man who needed to be home with his children, none of them truly understanding the predatory nature of the man they were defending. Father Michael O'Connell, a priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Dennis frequently volunteered, wrote a glowing letter to the county prosecutor. O'Connell praised Dennis's exemplary character and his significant contributions to the parish's charitable works, arguing that sending such a dedicated community member to jail would be a gross injustice to both the church and the town. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery made by Detective Pat O'Reilly was a report dated November 1988, just 4 months before Aundria disappeared. In it, 14-year-old Aundria had confided in a teacher that she was afraid to go home because her father was abusive. The school immediately sent a social worker to the Bowman residence, but the report offered few details about what investigators actually found inside the home. Instead, it simply noted that local authorities had determined the allegations were unfounded. Dennis and Brenda denied everything, insisting that Aundria was merely acting out after recently learning she was adopted. The explanation was accepted. Aundria was left in the home and the report quietly disappeared into police files without further investigation. For Kathy Turkanian, the discovery was devastating. Even 11 years later, after Dennis was forced onto the sex offender registry following the Vandenbrink case, no one in law enforcement had ever seriously revisited the possibility that his past might be connected to Aundria's disappearance. Exposing Dennis's past fundamentally changed Kathy's reality. If Dennis was capable of stalking, armed assault, and home invasion, the runaway theory collapsed. Kathy began to doubt that Aundria was the Racine County Jane Doe. That theory relied on Aundria surviving for 10 years after leaving home, and Kathy now feared her daughter had never made it out of Ottawa County alive. Kathy became obsessed with the Bowmans' current property on 134th Avenue in Salem Township. Although the family had moved there shortly after Aundria vanished, Kathy spent hours scouring satellite imagery on Google Earth. She eventually zeroed in on a specific patch of disturbed earth in the backyard, convinced it was her daughter's final resting place. She pleaded with investigators to search the land. But the American legal system demands more than a mother's intuition to cross a property line. Carl Koppelman, applying the lens of behavioral profiling, disagreed with Kathy's backyard theory. He argued that killers rarely take the calculated risk of exhuming and relocating a body to a new property. If Aundria had been buried, he believed her remains were likely still hidden near the family's original farm on Lincoln Road. Law enforcement, however, remained unmoved. Citing a lack of physical evidence, they denied Kathy's request for a search warrant, reinforcing the stone wall she had been running into for years. But there was another barrier, one far more absolute. Aundria's adoption had been a closed proceeding. It was a legal maneuver that had permanently severed Kathy's parental rights and transferred them entirely to the Bowmans. In the eyes of the law, Kathy Turkanian was a stranger to her own daughter. She had no legal standing, no authority to demand action, no right to case files as a next of kin, and no way to force the system to listen. All she had left was her intuition and a growing, sickening certainty. Aundria had never made it out of Ottawa County. Kathy took her fight to the court of public opinion. She used social media to publicly brand Dennis Bowman a murderer, creating pages on Facebook and Classmates.com to invite Aundria's old friends to share their memories. What emerged were disturbing accounts of Dennis's past volatility and whispers of abuse. Kathy even went as far as erecting a billboard, offering an $11,000 reward for information, and publicly declaring her suspicion that Dennis had buried her daughter in his backyard. Then, in 2013, the news Kathy both craved and feared finally arrived. DNA testing confirmed that Kathy was not a biological match to the Racine County Jane Doe. The result was a devastating blow to the hope that Aundria might have lived a life, any life, after 1989. But for Kathy, it only hardened her resolve. If Aundria wasn't in Wisconsin, she was with Dennis. In September of that year, Kathy and Carl met in person at the Missing in Michigan conference, an event designed to generate leads for cold cases. They wore matching t-shirts emblazoned with the words, "Find Aundria Bowman." As Carl scanned the room, he spotted two familiar faces. Brenda recognized Kathy immediately from her vocal Facebook campaign. She approached, not with shame, but with a defensive fire. As Brenda began defending herself and Dennis, Kathy suddenly cut her off. "Tell them the truth, Brenda," she blurted out. "Tell them about your husband." The confrontation quickly drew attention before conference organizers stepped in and calmed things down. Brenda insisted that she and Dennis had cooperated fully back in 1989, even producing a folder of old notes and flyers as proof of their effort. When Carl gently pressed her about Dennis's violent criminal history, Brenda's response was bone-chilling in its loyalty. "I haven't forgotten what he did," she said flatly, "but I've forgiven him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." With Brenda standing as a human shield between the truth and the law, the Michigan investigation hit a dead end. Dennis Bowman remained a free man, protected by his wife's silence and a lack of physical evidence. Was Dennis truly responsible for Aundria's disappearance? Or was Kathy's crusade merely fueled by a mother's grief and suspicion toward a man with a dark past? Let us know what you think in the comments. As it turned out, the truth didn't lie in the soil of Michigan. It was waiting 700 miles away, buried in a cold case file from 1980. The key to the mystery belonged to a woman named Kathleen O'Brien Doyle. In 1980, Kathleen was 25 years old and living in Norfolk, Virginia. She was a newlywed, married to a Navy pilot named Stephen Doyle. They had only been married for 5 months when duty called. Stephen was deployed aboard the USS Eisenhower, leaving Kathleen at home with only her orange tabby cat for company. As a military wife, she was used to the solitude, but by September, the silence coming from her home became ominous. When worried friends went to check on her, they were met with a scene of pure horror. Kathleen was found dead in her bedroom, the house around her violently ransacked. She had been bound and gagged, and the state of her body was so traumatizing that it shook even the most veteran first responders. The autopsy revealed the sheer brutality of the killer. Kathleen had been strangled with a cord, stabbed multiple times, and subjected to a vicious sexual assault. The medical examiner placed her time of death between 7:30 p.m. and midnight on September 10th. With no witnesses and a scarcity of physical evidence, the investigation into Kathleen's murder quickly stalled, joining the ranks of the forgotten, until now. The silence lasted nearly 4 decades. It wasn't until 2018 that the Norfolk Cold Case Squad and Detective Jonathan Smith turned to a new frontier that was beginning to revolutionize criminal justice: investigative genetic genealogy. The department decided to retest DNA profiles preserved on a bedsheet from Kathleen's home. They sent the samples to a genealogy company, and after nearly a year of complex analysis, Detective Smith received a list of 32 names. These weren't direct matches, but distant relatives who formed the branches of a sprawling genetic family tree. At the epicenter of that web sat a name that meant nothing to the Virginia authorities, but everything to a grieving mother in Michigan: Dennis Lee Bowman. Detective Smith began digging into Bowman's background, and what he found immediately set off alarm bells. He discovered a history of violence in Bowman's home state. Internet searches revealed that in May 1980, just months before Kathleen's murder, Bowman had been the suspect in the attempted murder and sexual assault of a cyclist in Holland, Michigan. Smith also uncovered the fact that Bowman's adoptive daughter, Aundria, had vanished in 1989 under deeply suspicious circumstances. Armed with these red flags, Smith attended a cold case conference with police departments from across the country. There, he tracked down a detective sergeant from the Michigan State Police and asked him about Dennis Bowman. The sergeant's response was swift and chilling. "I'll tell you what, John, I know Dennis, and I know his family. He's probably exactly who you're looking for." Smith collaborated with local authorities in Grand Rapids to pull old records. A court transcript from September 1980 provided the final smoking gun. It confirmed that Dennis Bowman had been in Norfolk for a 2-week military training exercise that perfectly overlapped with the window of Kathleen Doyle's murder. Knowing they had a strong suspect, Virginia investigators contacted the Allegan County Sheriff's Office in Michigan. They needed a fresh DNA sample from Dennis to compare against the biological evidence recovered from Kathleen Doyle's crime scene, but obtaining it without alerting him would require patience. Ironically, the opportunity came from Dennis himself. During his visit to the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to file a harassment complaint against Kathy Turkanian, investigators invited him into an interview room and casually offered him a bottle of water while discussing Kathy's online accusations. Dennis drank from the bottle as he vented his frustrations, completely unaware that investigators were paying closer attention to the bottle than to his words. After he left the room, detectives quietly collected it and rushed it to the lab. Weeks later, the results came back. The DNA recovered from the water bottle was an exact match to the biological material collected from Kathleen Doyle's murder scene nearly 39 years earlier. In November 2019, Norfolk police flew to Michigan to arrest 70-year-old Dennis Bowman. He was taken into custody, pending extradition to Virginia to face charges for the murder of Kathleen Doyle. Even after the handcuffs clicked, Brenda Bowman remained in a state of total denial. She refused to believe the allegations, insisting her husband couldn't have done it because he wasn't in Norfolk at the time, a belief that flew in the face of his own military records. As officers led Dennis to the patrol car, Brenda screamed after them, "Dennis, I believe in you. I'll hire the best lawyer I can. We're going to prove you're innocent." Dennis was transported to the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to be held for extradition. Upon arrival, Detective Jonathan Smith entered the interrogation room. He chose a calculated psychological approach. He deliberately removed his badge to lower the tension, creating an atmosphere where Dennis might feel comfortable enough to start talking. The tactic worked. Dennis slowly began to open up. He spoke of his parents, detailing a fractured relationship with them, and shared his lifelong obsession with bladed weapons. As the conversation flowed and a strange rapport developed, Dennis finally felt comfortable enough to provide the details of the Kathleen Doyle case. He admitted he had been in Norfolk for a training camp that lasted about a week. He described feeling stressed and isolated. He told the detective that he had decided to leave the naval base to clear his head, ended up at a bar, and got heavily intoxicated. It was the beginning of a confession 40 years in the making. According to Dennis, he had been wandering the streets, disoriented, until he spotted a darkened house with no car in the driveway. He decided to break in, looking for cash. He recounted moving through the home until he opened a door and startled Kathleen, who began to scream. Dennis claimed he covered her mouth with his left hand and shoved her with his right, the hand holding a pocket knife. He alleged that as she fell, she grabbed his arm, causing the knife to accidentally plunge into her. He maintained that he fled immediately while she was still alive and moving on the bed, telling her as he left that he was going. But there was one part of the crime Dennis continued struggling to admit. Even with DNA evidence tying him directly to Kathleen Doyle, he repeatedly denied ever sexually assaulting her.
A sexual experience is not one that you forget, okay? It's just not, drunk or not drunk, all right? There's a lot involved.
And
right?
I don't ever remember having sex with that woman.
Well, you did.
Not ever.
You did, okay?
Your DNA was in her. We've got to get over the fact that you can't remember that. Because, Dennis, how is this going to look to other people?
I don't care
I'm
if
just
it looks
asking.
like anything to them. I don't remember having sex with this woman.
If you honestly, legitimately cannot remember it, then
I didn't do that.
Okay. Are you okay, Dennis?
No. No, I'm not.
Even decades later, Dennis seemed unable or unwilling to fully confront the reality of what he had done. The strangest part of the interrogation was how selectively he remembered the crime. Dennis could describe entering the house and confronting Kathleen in detail, yet repeatedly claimed he could not remember the sexual assault, even when confronted with DNA evidence proving it happened. Psychologists often associate this kind of behavior with a form of self-deception known as the illusory truth effect, where repeatedly telling the same version of events can gradually blur the line between intentional lying and genuine belief. Over time, a person may begin mentally separating themselves from the parts of the crime they find most difficult to accept. In Dennis's case, the accidental stabbing narrative allowed him to preserve a version of himself that felt less monstrous than the reality described by the physical evidence. Was Dennis truly blocking parts of the crime from his memory? Or was he consciously distancing himself from the most brutal aspects of what he had done to Kathleen Doyle? When Detective Smith asked how he felt during the attack, Dennis refused to take responsibility. Instead, he blamed a demon that had taken possession of him. His demeanor shifted. Smith later noted that Dennis appeared haunted, or perhaps simply performative. Dennis even sketched the entity in a notebook, a horned figure with a pointed beard, which he claimed represented the force inside him that wanted out. But the moment investigators confronted Dennis with the full brutality of the crime, the bindings, the strangulation, the multiple stab wounds, his composure began to crack. The confident explanations faded into silence. He avoided eye contact, gave fragmented answers, and retreated inward as though trying to escape the reality of what he had done. After Detective Smith left the room, the interrogation cameras continued recording. At first, Dennis whispered to himself, "I didn't do it." But moments later, the denial seemed to collapse under its own weight. "I did it again," he muttered quietly. "I did it again." Dennis Bowman was now a confirmed killer. But while justice was finally in motion for Kathleen Doyle, the fate of the daughter he had reported missing 30 years prior remained a mystery. Investigators knew that the leverage they now held over him was the world's only hope of finding Aundria. With Dennis in custody for the Virginia murder, the timeline for Aundria's case accelerated. Investigators knew that once he was extradited to face a life sentence in Virginia, the chance of closing the Michigan case would vanish. Dennis was the prime suspect, but canine searches of his property had yielded nothing. The earth kept its secrets, and Brenda remained a silent sentry, protecting her husband despite the mounting evidence of his double life. To break the stalemate, police proposed a grim bargain. They knew Dennis's priority wasn't his conscience. It was his comfort. They offered him a choice: If he revealed the location of Aundria's remains, he would be allowed to serve his time in a Michigan prison, where Brenda and Vanessa could visit him. If he refused, he would be sent to Virginia immediately, severed from them forever. After initial resistance, Dennis agreed, but only on the condition that he be allowed to speak to Brenda under supervision. Before his wife arrived, he carefully checked to ensure the interrogation room cameras were recording, a performance for posterity. When Brenda entered, he finally confessed, though the story he told was a carefully choreographed half-truth designed to minimize his guilt. He admitted Aundria had been dead since the day she disappeared in 1989. He spun a narrative for his wife that cast him as a panicked father rather than a predator. He claimed he had returned home with Vanessa to find Aundria packing her bags. When he confronted her, he alleged she threatened to tell her therapists again that he had been sexually abusing her. He claimed an argument ensued. He struck her, and she fell backward down the stairs. He told Brenda that when he reached the bottom, her head was at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were open. He realized her pulse had stopped. He told Brenda he couldn't bear to lose her by going to prison for an accident, so he wrapped Aundria in a blanket and hid her in the barn before reporting her missing. As for the body, he offered a gruesome disposal method. He told Brenda he later moved the remains into a cardboard box, and days later placed it out with a neighbor's trash for pickup. He claimed he believed the body had been hauled to a landfill and incinerated. Brenda wept as she listened, but her loyalty remained unshaken. She told Dennis she forgave him. She told him she still loved him. Investigators and Kathy Turkanian were immediately skeptical. The story felt like a textbook attempt to blame the victim for her own death. Furthermore, police found the trash pickup story far too risky for someone as calculating as Dennis. They began monitoring his communications, and it didn't take long for their suspicions to be confirmed. They intercepted letters Dennis sent to Brenda from jail, writings that directly contradicted his confession. In a letter dated December 12, 2019, Dennis wrote that he hadn't put the body in the trash. Instead, he had placed her in a private cemetery. In another letter, he described the clothes she was buried in, with haunting detail: jeans, her favorite sweater, and a gold necklace. He mentioned that over the last 30 years, he had walked past her resting place more than 100 times. Faced with these contradictions, investigators confronted him again. Dennis remained stubborn, vowing to take the location to his grave. Authorities then turned to the only person Dennis trusted, Brenda. They laid out the cold reality. Without the body, the deal was off, and Dennis would be moved to Virginia permanently. Under this pressure, and driven by a sudden desire to give Aundria a proper cremation, Brenda finally begged him to tell the truth. Finally, Dennis cracked. He admitted the story about the trash pickup was just another smokescreen. He confessed that he had initially buried Aundria in the backyard of the rental house on Lincoln Road, where they lived at the time of the murder. But when the family moved to their new home on 134th Avenue, he did the unthinkable. Under the cover of darkness, he exhumed her remains and reburied them in the backyard of his new house. He had brought his victim with him, a horrific souvenir kept under his absolute control. Police returned to the property on 134th Avenue with heavy machinery. In a haunting validation of years of maternal intuition, the exact spot Dennis pointed to was the same patch of disturbed earth Kathy Turkanian had identified on Google Earth years earlier. The very lead police had once dismissed as mere speculation. The excavation revealed a shallow grave. Inside, investigators found a large trash bag containing 4 smaller bags. The contents pointed to a deliberate attempt at concealment. Used diapers had been packed alongside the remains, likely to mask the scent of decomposition from cadaver dogs or nearby neighbors. A candy wrapper dated 1989 was also recovered from the grave. DNA testing later confirmed what investigators already feared. It was Aundria Bowman. Even after the discovery, Brenda's loyalty to Dennis remained deeply unsettling. During court proceedings in February 2021, Brenda testified that she had always believed Aundria was a runaway. She claimed she had made missing person posters and said she only learned the truth after Dennis was arrested for Kathleen Doyle's murder. But her testimony revealed something far more disturbing.
At some point when Aundria was approximately 13 to 14 years old, do you recall her making a disclosure about abuse by the defendant?
Yes.
Was that sexual abuse?
She told me one morning that Dad had molested her. And I looked at her and I told her, and I says, and that's a lie and you know it. He said that Aundria had run away. She had taken money out of the baby's bedroom and she had taken the income tax money off his dresser and took her duffel bag and she was gone.
What makes this case so disturbing is that Brenda admitted Aundria had once told her that Dennis molested her. But instead of protecting her daughter or reporting the allegation, Brenda immediately dismissed it as a lie. Was Brenda simply another victim living under the control of a violent predator? Or had years of loyalty and denial made her unwilling to accept what was happening inside her own home? If Aundria truly tried to warn the adults around her about what was happening, then one of the most heartbreaking parts of this case is that nobody chose to believe her. For 30 years, Aundria was right there, not missing, not lost, just hidden. With the truth finally exposed, investigators also began uncovering the wider pattern of Dennis Bowman's predatory behavior. He admitted to multiple sexual assaults in San Diego, both before and during his marriage to Brenda, along with another attack at a mobile home park in Michigan during the early 1980s. Investigators still suspect Kathleen Doyle may not have been his only murder victim, though Dennis has never confessed to any additional killings. On February 7, 2022, faced with overwhelming evidence, Dennis Bowman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Aundria Bowman. The judge, visibly disturbed by the details of the case, remarked that few crimes in his career had affected him as deeply. Dennis received a sentence of 35 to 50 years in prison before eventually being transferred to Virginia to serve 2 life sentences for the murder of Kathleen Doyle. After decades of lies, manipulation, and violence, Dennis Bowman would never walk free again. But even with the conviction, there was no true sense of closure. After Aundria's remains were cremated, Brenda offered to give half of the ashes to Kathy Turkanian. To Kathy, the gesture felt unbearable. She believed her daughter had spent her entire life being divided by the decisions of others, and even in death, that division still continued. For more than 30 years, Kathy searched for answers that few others seemed willing to pursue. What began as a mother's instinct eventually uncovered the truth investigators had overlooked for decades. She had given her daughter up as an infant, hoping to give her a safer and happier life. Instead, she spent decades trying to learn what had happened to the little girl she never stopped thinking about. In the end, Aundria Bowman was never the runaway people believed she was. She was a 14-year-old girl who tried to tell adults she was afraid to go home. How many other children have tried to ask for help only to be dismissed as troubled or acting out? How many cold cases still sit unresolved because the warning signs were ignored long before the crime itself was uncovered? And if investigators had taken Aundria's allegations seriously in 1988, would she still be alive today? More than 30 years after she disappeared, Aundria was finally found, not hundreds of miles away, not living under another identity, but buried in the backyard of the man who convinced everyone she had simply run away.